So as you know, I have two channels. On one channel, I talk about anti-natalism, and on this channel, I talk about anarchy and issues related to the Black community. Now, sometimes people come from my anti-natalist channel onto this channel, and maybe they hear some content and they get offended. I recently did a video about the Moors and their role in obtaining American independence. I believe that video was pretty tepid. It was innocuous. I don't think that I said anything that was controversial. It wasn't inflammatory. And to be honest, I could have done a much more controversial video. Like, I chose between two different approaches. I just said something about how they help legitimize America's independence, but there was a different video that I could have done discussing the Moors and the relationship to Europe and the Black Plagues, how they brought mathematics and science. I didn't go with that video just because I thought, well, first of all, I'm not going to get that many views anyway. I'm probably going to alienate people. I most version, yet people still got offended. So here's the thing. I've done other content in the past. I've done content about, well, I was reviewing an article which was discussing slavery and how Black men were raped by their mistresses, right? This wasn't my language, by the way. The language that I used was based on what the article said. And it called those women degenerates specifically because those women were raping their slaves. So I'm not sure, people probably listen to some of this content I've done and they get offended. By the way, that video went viral. That was my most successful video I've ever done. I'm not taking it down specifically because that is the video which got my channel monetized. Most of my subscribers came from that one video. So even if you are offended, I'm not going to take it down. At the end of the day, this is a free market, and my supporters tell me what type of content I should be producing. When I talk about some of this other stuff, which is, I don't know, standard type of content, people say that I'm boring, right? By all indications, that is probably the type of content that I should be producing because that is the type of content that people want. I understand that's going to alienate people, but at the end of the day, I am trying to grow my channel. So if you want me to produce that, if you don't want me to produce that type of content, then the response would be to support the content that you think that I should be producing. But again, when I make that type of content, I tend to get more views. So you can say that I'm trying to be race baiting or whatever. No, at the end of the day, this is historically accurate. I verified the sources. This actually happened. There are actual court cases where their mistresses were raping their male slaves. The males were considered concubines. Anyway, I want to move past that because, again, there's a version of the Moors that I didn't even go into, which is far more controversial than the one that I actually discussed. But I assumed that people would get offended, and I assumed that nobody would listen to it. So I can still do it. We still have some days left in February. But again, if I were to do that second version, people will get offended because they have not heard it. But I don't think the issue is the tone. It's not that I said anything accusatory. I think the issue is that it's the very fact that we even have the audacity to have a history, right? How dare you have a history which is separate from everybody else's history? So regardless of the tone, people are going to get offended no matter what. Now, the question of whether Black History Month is racist is not just wrong, it's revealing. And the fact that it is being asked at all explains why the month is necessary. Black History Month is not racist, it is necessary and is an act of survival. The very question is being asked demonstrates why the month exists in the first place. Now let's get into the history of Black History Month. Black History Month was not born out of political agitation. It was born from a scholar's conviction that a people without a recorded history will eventually be forgotten. In 1926, Carter G. Woodson, a Harvard-educated historian, established Negro History Month, choosing February to honor the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Woodson's belief was simple: if a race had no recorded history, its achievements will be forgotten and its people will disappear from the human story. This was an act of intellectual preservation, not political provocation. In 1976, during the 19 states bicentennial, Negro History Week was expanded into Black History Month and officially recognized by the federal government. Canada also recognized Black History Month in 1995. The United Kingdom adopted it in October of that same year. Black History Month was never a political stunt or an attack on any group. It was a scholar saying that a history matters and must be told. The main objections to Black History Month, that it is exclusionary, divisive, or an exercise in victimhood, do not hold up under scrutiny, and that inconsistency with which they are applied reveals a deeper problem. A common objection includes claims that the month is exclusionary and that Black people are simply dwelling on the past. Each of these objections serves they deserve an honest examination rather than a dismissal. The claim that Black History Month is exclusionary is the most ironic objection of all time. Black people spent the better part of recorded American history being excluded from history books entirely. These textbooks were filled with faces, inventors, and statesmen who shared no cultural lineage with them. Creating a space to correct that omission is not exclusion. It is the correction of exclusion. The selective nature of the offense exposes the inconsistency at its core. Nobody accuses Women's History Month of being discriminatory against men. Nobody protests Asian Pacific Heritage Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, or Jewish Holocaust remembrance as attacks on other groups. The outrage appears specific and uniquely when Black people discuss their history, which demands an explanation. Further, it is impossible for Black people to discuss their own history without referencing their relationship to other people's history, and that is not a choice. It is simply the nature of what history is. The objective facts are that Black people were enslaved by whites. They were the victims of Jim Crow laws designed and enforced by the dominant society. They were subjected to segregation, redlining, and systemic exclusion by a society that was not racially neutral. These are not opinions, they are historical facts, and they involve other people by definition. Every group's history is relational. You cannot tell the story of Jewish history without discussing Nazi Germany. You cannot tell the story of Native Americans without discussing European colonization. You cannot tell the story of women's history without discussing the patriarchal structures that oppress them. History does not exist in a vacuum. It happens between groups, between the powerful and the powerless, between the oppressor and the oppressed. But Black people are uniquely expected to discuss their history in a way that somehow omits the other party. They are supposed to celebrate their resilience without mentioning what they were resilient against. They are supposed to acknowledge their suffering without naming who caused it. They are supposed to tell the story of slavery without mentioning slaveholders, the story of Jim Crow without mentioning the society that built it, the story of segregation without mentioning who constructed and maintained these systems. This is not history. This is sanitized, decontextualized performance of history, stripped away of everything that would make anyone uncomfortable, and therefore stripped of everything that makes it true. The people demanding that performance are the same ones who claim to have no problem with history, so long as it doesn't implicate anybody, so long as it connects to nothing, so long as it floats in a complete isolation from the world that produced it. This demand is not reasonable. It is intellectually incoherent. You cannot tell a story without being prohibited from mentioning the other characters in it. And imposing that prohibition exclusively on Black people, while no other group is held to the same standard, is yet another expression of the asymmetry at the heart of this entire debate. It must be stated clearly and directly, acknowledging what was done to Black people by the white control system, its institutions and laws, is not the same as hating white people. It is a critique of a system, not an indictment of a race. The conflation of these two is one of the primary tools used to shut down the conversation entirely. The moment someone says slavery caused generational damage or Jim Crow was designed to keep Black people from building wealth, the response is often, so you hate white people or you're anti-white. And that accusation is designed to do one thing: make Black people so defensive that they abandon the argument entirely. But critiquing a system and hating a people are not the same thing. And everyone understands this distinction in every other context. Criticizing capitalism is not the same as hating business owners. Criticizing institutional failures of the Catholic Church is not the same as hating Catholics. Criticizing the way the American military has been deployed is not the same as hating soldiers. Systems can be critiqued independently of the individuals within them. That is a basic principle of intellectual honesty that is accepted everywhere, except apparently in conversations about race. White supremacy as a system, the set of laws, policies, institutions, and social structures that privilege white people and disadvantage Blacks can be examined, critiqued, and condemned without that critique being directed at any individual white person who is alive today, acknowledging that the system existed, that it caused damage, and that its effects are still felt. It's not hatred, it is history. The insistence on collapsing that distinction, on treating every critique of the system as a personal attack on white individuals, is itself a deflection. It redirects the conversation away from the argument being made towards a defense of white people's feelings. And once that redirection succeeds, the original argument never gets addressed. Black people discussing their history are not asking white people to feel guilty for what their ancestors did. They are not asking to be allowed to tell the truth about what happened and to have that truth acknowledged rather than defended against. That's not hatred. That is the minimum requirement for an honest conversation. The people who tell Blacks that race does not matter are often the very people who get offended by Black History Month, and their offense proves that race does matter. Many of the people who oppose Black History Month on the grounds that race doesn't matter are the same people whose emotional reaction proves that it does matter enormously. If race genuinely did not matter, Black history would produce no reaction at all. It would roll like any other month. A strong emotional reaction is an admission, not an argument. Telling Black people that race is irrelevant while feeling personally wounded by the celebration of Black heritage is not a coherent position. It is hypocrisy. It demands that racial identity be dismissed only when it belongs to someone else. It says that your racial identity apparently remains exempt from that demand because you're still going to celebrate your history, but you're telling someone else to silence theirs. Pride in one's racial heritage is not wrong, but it cannot be extended to oneself by being denied to others. You cannot claim pride in your own heritage and simultaneously argue that someone else's pride in theirs is racist. That double standard is a problem and needs to be named. The same people who glorify their own heritage and their own heroes constantly, and they do not think twice about it because to them, It is not glorification. It is simply correct. The reason it feels correct to them is not because it is objectively more valid. It is because it is the only narrative they have ever been exposed to. They have never encountered a competing story, so the dominant story feels like the neutral truth rather than a particular perspective. Some of these people will routinely make disparaging comments about other groups, comments that reflect the official historical narrative, and they do not consider this offensive. It's simply the truth to them. It's just the way things are. And everyone else is expected to absorb it, to tolerate it, and not react. However, the moment someone else says that they have a story which deviates from the official narrative, the moment that Black people introduce a fact, a figure, or a perspective that was not a part of the official story that was told, the tolerance disappears entirely. There is no grace. There is no patience. There is immediate protest and pushback. Consider what would happen if Black people applied the same standard in reverse. If every time the dominant society glorified its own history or made a disparaging remark about another group or repeated a complete narrative, Black people reacted with the same zero tolerance that is applied to them, we would be protesting constantly. We would not be able to have a single conversation. The noise would be deafening. But we do not do that. We absorb it. We sit through it. We extend the grace of allowing others to tell their stories, celebrate their heroes, and operate from their own narrative, even when that narrative excludes or demeans us. We do not get the same grace in return. And the people who refuse to extend it don't even notice the asymmetry, because inside the dominative narrative, their reactions feel like reasonable corrections, not like double standards. The asymmetry is not a minor inconvenience. It is a form of control. It says your story is welcome only when it confirms ours. The moment it challenges ours, it becomes a provocation. The asymmetry in and of itself is a form of privilege. Not privilege in the abstract, not privilege as a statistic or a policy, but privilege operating in the texture of everyday conversation. Privilege is not only about what you have, it's also about what you never have to think about. It's the freedom to celebrate your heroes without being divisive. It's the freedom to tell your story without being accused of having an agenda. It's the freedom to react with outrage when someone challenges your narrative, while the people whose narratives have been challenged, erased, and distorted for centuries are expected to sit quietly and absorb it. The dominant group does not notice this freedom because they have never been without it. And the moment you point it out, the defensiveness, the denial, the insistence that no such asymmetry exists, that reaction is itself further proof of the very privilege being described. Many of these people argue that Black people should stop talking about race altogether and simply be American, that racial identity is divisive, and that a shared national identity should be sufficient. This argument sounds like an appeal to utility, but it is not, because the American identity they are describing is not racial or culturally neutral. It is a specific ethnic and cultural texture that is Anglo. Anglo-Saxon legal and cultural tradition is not uniquely assumed in American life. It is openly celebrated, explicitly documented, and institutionally enshrined. It is written into the common law foundations of the American legal system. It is cited by name in the Supreme Court opinions and legal scholarship. It is referenced in the Federalist Papers. It is embedded in the very architecture of American governance. Beyond law, Anglo and European ethnic heritage is celebrated openly and without controversy across American life in St. Patrick's Day parades and Italian American Heritage Month, and Greek, Polish, Irish, and German cultural festivals, Oktoberfest, and Columbus Day celebrations. None of these are accused of being divisive. None of them are told to simply be American and stop celebrating their heritage. The demand to just be American is therefore not a demand for racial neutrality. It is a demand for a specific kind of assimilation. It says, absorb our cultural tradition, celebrate our heritage, operate within our historical framework, and do not bring your own. This is not a civic identity. This is a cultural dominance dressed as patriotism. If the standard were generally just be American, it would be applied equally to everyone. Anglo heritage festivals would be just as controversial as Black History Month. European ethnic pride would be just as suspect as Black pride. The fact that it does not work that way, that one group's ethnic heritage is treated as synonymous with American identity, while another is treated as a threat to it, is the double standard laid bare. You cannot encode your own ethnic heritage into legal and cultural foundations as a nation, celebrate it openly in its institutions and public life, and then tell other groups that talking about their own heritage is divisive. That is not unity. That is a demand that everyone else disappear into your story while you remain fully visible institutionally yourself. This same hypocrisy reveals itself when Black people discuss historical wrongs committed against their ancestors, and certain listeners take personal offense. When someone says, white people enslaved my ancestors, or my ancestors were raped and brutalized, they are discussing their own history. They are contextualizing their own people's experience and suffering. But some people listen and hear it not as a discussion of Black history, but as a personal attack, as if acknowledging what happened to Black people is the same as accusing every white person alive today. The reason they experience it as a personal attack is precisely because of their own deep attachment to their racial identity. They have identified so strongly with whiteness as a group that any criticism of what white people did historically feels like a criticism of them personally. This is the same racial identity attachment they claim to not have, the same one they insist does not and should not matter. If race truly did not matter to them, a historical discussion about slavery would land as history, not as an accusation. The fact that it lands as an accusation is proof that their racial identity is very much alive, very much invested, and is very much at stake. Black people are not responsible for managing the racial fragility of others when discussing their own history. You should not get offended by someone else's pain simply because the people who cause the pain share your racial identity. Black History Month is not an exercise in grievance or victimhood. It is an aspirational tool designed to show Black people what they're capable of by showing them what their ancestors already did. The criticism that Black people should get over the past fundamentally misunderstands what Black History Month is for. The month is not about wallowing in suffering or dwelling in grievance. It is about aspiration, about showing people what is possible by showing them what has already been done. When a Black child learns about the contributions of Black inventors, scientists, and leaders, something fundamental shifts in how they see themselves. Lewis Howard Ledermeyer developed the carbon filament that made the electric light bulb practicable. Garrett Morgan invented the traffic signal. Charles Drew pioneered blood banks. Katherine Johnson's mathematical calculation sent men to the moon. Madam C. Walker became the first self-made female millionaire in American history. The Tuskegee Airmen flew with precision and courage that shattered every race's assumption about their capabilities. That child stopped seeing themselves as a footnote and start seeing themselves as a contributor, as someone whose people shape the civilization they inhabit. This is not living in the past. This is about using the past to construct a future. Depriving a people of their history causes measurable, documented psychological damage, and the effects are visible in how some people, Black people, see themselves and their potential. Identity development, self-esteem, and a sense of personal agency are deeply tied to the narratives people absorb about who they are and where they come from. When a child grows up seeing themselves represented only as victims or property, The damage is not abstract, it is measurable. It manifests in low self-esteem, an external locus of control, and a learned helplessness that says people like you cannot change their circumstances. The dominant society assumes that its pride and self-esteem exist in a vacuum, that individuals simply gave these things to themselves. But self-esteem is built on a foundation of stories, images, and role models that reflect your own identity back at you. Those who have always had that foundation cannot imagine what it costs to be without it. It is impossible to overstate what it does to a person's sense of self to grow up in a society where the only thing they know about themselves is slavery. If the only story you are told about your people is one of bondage and victimization, that story becomes your psychological inheritance. The absence of counter narratives of heroes, inventors, builders, and leaders who look like you leaves that inheritance unchallenged. The connection between historical erasure, damaged self-esteem, and destructive behavior is not theoretical. It is supported by research in psychology and criminology, and it has a real measurable consequence. There are Black people who have internalized the belief that white people are smarter, more capable, and more deserving of success, not because it is true, but because every institution they encountered reinforced that message. They were never given a counter narrative. They cannot think completely, they cannot compete intellectually. They don't think that they're capable of changing their circumstances, and they believe that success is for other people. Psychologist Robert Seller's multi-dimensional model of racial identity found that Black individuals with a strong positive sense of racial identity show significantly better mental health outcomes and greater resilience against the psychological damage of discrimination. Knowing who you are and being proud of it is not vanity, it is armor. Criminology research consistently reveals low self-esteem and an external locus of control as among the strongest predictors of criminal behavior. When someone does not believe they are capable of legitimate success, the internal calculation around risk shifts dramatically. A person who does not believe they have a future worth protecting has little incentive to protect it. Studies on cultural response education have found that when Black students learn their history in an affirmative, empowering way, dropout rates fell, academic engagement rises, and involvement in delinquent behavior decreases. The Tuscan Unified School District Mexican American Studies program produced documented data showing exactly this pattern before it was controversially banned. Knowledge of one's history does not make young people dangerous, it makes them invested. When Black people learn their history, they stop seeing themselves as relegated to the margins and start seeing themselves as capable of competing, contributing, and building something. They no longer see themselves as part of an unconscious script that limits their self-image. They understand that people like them have always been capable because the evidence is right there in their own history. The people who believe representation is unnecessary have never been without it, and that absence of awareness is itself a form of privilege. Those who have grown up seeing themselves as the heroes of every story, the inventors of every innovation, the leaders of every nation in their textbook do not understand why representation matters because they have never had to search for themselves and come up empty. They believe people should simply validate themselves internally without needing to see themselves reflected in the world. This is only possible for those who have always been reflected. Their self-esteem was not self-generated. It was built by a society that consistently showed them people who look like them doing extraordinary things. They have simply never had to notice that foundation because it was always there. Having received that foundation, some people turn around and then suggest to others that they do not need it, that asking for it is an imposition. This is not self-sufficiency. That is the erasure of one's privilege. The fact that someone else's pride feels threatening reveals that someone else's sense of superiority is comparative, dependent on someone else's feeling inferior. And that is a problem with the system, not with Black pride. If a person is genuinely secure in their own identity and history, another group celebrating theirs should produce no reaction whatsoever. The fact that it does suggests that the sense of superiority is not self-generated, it is comparative. It depends on someone else occupying a lower position, and when that person begins to rise, it feels like a personal attack. Black History Month is not an attack. It never was. But the discomfort it produces reveals something important about the system it created. Pride is not a finite resource. One group having it does not diminish another's supply. White people are absolutely entitled to pride in their history, but that entitlement extends equally to Black people. Insisting otherwise is not confidence, it is insecurity dressed as principle. If you are truly proud of your heritage, be magnanimous enough to allow others the same pride without interpreting it as a statement against you. Other people should not have to feel inferior in order for you to feel superior. Demanding they suppress their identity to protect your ego is not a defensible position. The opposition to Black History Month extends into private spaces, which reveals that the real objection is not how Black history is discussed, but the fact that it is discussed at all. When Black people have private conversations about their histories, there are those who feel entitled to insert themselves and express offense. This is not a public debate about whether Black history should be discussed in public schools or in government curriculum. This is about objecting to a group discussing their own history, even in their own private spaces. If Black history is not taught in schools, and for the most part it's not, then who is supposed to teach it? If we're not allowed to discuss it publicly without defense, and we're also not allowed to discuss it privately without intrusion, the implicit demand is that Black people remain ignorant of their own history. This is not a reasonable demand, and no group should be expected to comply with it. The willingness to insert oneself into private conversations about Black history reveals the objection is not the context. It's not about the context or tone. It is the subject itself. Significant chapters of Black achievement have been deliberately omitted from the mainstream history, and when Black people attempt to discuss them, they are gaslit into believing that that person's unfamiliarity is the same as falsehood. Entire chapters of Black achievement have been systematically removed from the historical record. We can talk about Black Wall Street, the Greenwood districts in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which were thriving economic centers destroyed by violence and buried in the historical record for decades. Black scientists had patents stolen, inventors had their names erased, and musicians had their innovations absorbed into mainstream culture without credit. We all know about Elvis, who was called the King, but in fact, he actually plagiarized a lot of Black musicians, but yet we still recognize him as the King, even though he did not even produce many of the works that he took credit for. Henrietta Lacks cell cancer cells became one of the most important tools in modern medical research, taken without her consent and largely uncredited for decades. If y'all don't know, Henrietta Lacks is the woman who had the cells that were immortal. She has these immortal cells which are used in cancer research. There's a whole video that I believe Oprah Winfrey produced on HBO. Black soldiers who fought in the American War were minimalized or ignored in the official record. When Black people share their documented variable facts about history, they're frequently met with immediate dismissal. The reaction is, I never heard of that. That can't be true. This sounds made up. The absence of the listener's own knowledge is treated as evidence of falsehood, as if I was not taught this, therefore it did not happen. This is the most self-defeating form of dismissal possible, using the success of the eraser as proof that there was nothing to erase in the first place. The reason you were not taught something is precisely the problem being addressed. Unfamiliarity with a fact about Black history is not a red flag. It is a flashing light pointing directly at the gap in the historical record that needs to be fulfilled. The appropriate response to unfamiliar history is not dismissal, it is curiosity and the humility to accept that one's own education may have been incomplete. All of our educations were incomplete in this regard. This incompleteness has consequences for the people whose stories were omitted and for the society that built itself on a partial truth. Underneath the guilt, the identity threat, and the discomfort lies the deepest and most dangerous assumption of all, that Black people are not the kinds of people who make history, and that any evidence to the contrary must be false. Some of the offense is rooted in pure, unprocessed superiority, not conscious racism, but a deeply embedded assumption that Black people are subjects of history, not makers of it. This assumption is so deeply woven into some people's psyche that it does not even register as an assumption, it feels like common sense. Black people are seen as recipients, footnotes, and subjects, not as builders, inventors, or civilizational contributors. When documented evidence contradicts this assumption, the reaction is not skepticism, it is a sense of absurdity. The facts do not feel wrong, they feel impossible. And that sense of absurdity is the most dangerous reaction of all, because it refuses to engage with the argument rather than weighting the evidence. From this assumption follows a complete unwillingness to research or verify facts about Black history. They make no attempt to look it up, to approach the subject with curiosity or exercise intellectual humility. They simply decide instantly that it is not worth discussing and it has no value. Any discussion of Black history is then interpreted not as education or cultural pride, but as an attack on people. They operated as if history is a competition with a fixed number of slots, as if adding Black names to the ledger means removing the white ones. Acknowledging that George Washington Carver revolutionized agricultural science does not erase Thomas Edison. Celebrating Granville Woods does not diminish Alexander Graham Bell. Contributions are not zero-sum. The conversation is difficult because precisely you cannot reason someone out of a position they did not reason themselves into. You cannot present facts onto someone who has already decided the facts are not credible, not because they examined them and found them wanting, but because they conflict with an assumption that has never been questioned. That is the work. That is what Black History Month is, and it's precisely why it cannot stop. The argument that Black people should not focus on their history because every group has problems is both a deflection and an unwitting argument in favor of Black History Month. Because Black people's specific problems are rooted in a specific history that needs to be understood and addressed. A common dismissal of Black History Month is that other groups have suffered too, that focusing on Black history is special pleading, that everyone has problems and that Black people should simply get on with solving theirs rather than dwelling on the past. This argument sounds reasonable on the surface, but collapses under scrutiny. Acknowledging Black History Month does not erase or diminish anyone else's suffering. The suffering of other groups is real and valid and does not need to be competed with. More importantly, the argument actually makes the case for Black History Month rather than against it. Yes, Black people have serious problems with self-esteem, educational attainment, economic inequality, overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, and generational poverty. These problems do not exist in a vacuum. They have specific historical causes: slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, systematic exclusion from wealth-building opportunities, and the deliberate erasure of Black identity and history. You cannot solve a problem you do not understand, and you cannot understand the present condition of Black communities without understanding the history that produced it. Black History Month is not a distraction from Black people's problem. It has a direct connection with solving the problem. A people who know their history, who have pride in their identity, who understand that their circumstances were shaped by specific historical forces rather than inherent inferiority are better equipped to change those circumstances. Self-esteem, agency, and historical knowledge are not luxuries. They are prerequisites for the kind of collective progress that those who have a desire to stop us talking about a history claim to want. Telling Black people to focus on their problems while simultaneously opposing the very thing that addresses the psychological root of those problems is not constructive advice. It is a contradiction. You cannot demand progress while removing the foundation that makes that progress possible. Black History Month is not the obstacle to Black advancement. The eraser of Black history is. Historical erasure is not only a psychological wound, it has direct, measurable economic consequences because a people who do not know their own economic history are less equipped to build economic power. Black economic history has been thoroughly erased as Black intellectual and cultural history, and the consequences are visible in the present. We talked about Black Wall Street, which was destroyed by mobs. This has not been taught in public schools. And this is not an isolated example. It is representative of a pattern of Black economic advancement that was systematically suppressed, stolen, or destroyed, and then buried in silence. Black inventors had patents, farmers had land seized through legal manipulation, redlining policies prevented Black families from building generational wealth. When Black people do not know this history, they cannot fully understand the economic gap they are navigating today. And they are more likely to internalize that gap as a reflection of their own inferiority rather than a result of deliberate and documented policy. Knowing that Black Wall Street existed and was destroyed tells a young Black person something critical. Your people have built wealth before and they can rebuild it again. That knowledge is not just emotionally empowering, it is economically actionable. It reframes the question from why can't we succeed to what was done to interrupt our success and how can we rebuild it. Black History Month, when it includes economic history, gives Black communities a roadmap, not just a source of pride, but a practical understanding of where the wealth went, how it was taken, and what reclaiming it might look like. So this message is to Black people specifically. Your history is not a consolation prize. It is not a participation trophy invented to make you feel better about a difficult present. It is real, it is documented, it is extraordinary, and it belongs to you. You come from a people who built civilization before your cities, who preserved knowledge when others lost it, who invented, discovered, composed, calculated, and constructed things that the world uses to this day. None of that requires anyone else's validation to be true. It was true before anyone acknowledged it and will remain true regardless of who refuses to acknowledge it. You do not need permission to know your own story. You do not need to wait for the dominant culture to include your history in its textbook before you're allowed to learn it, discuss it, and be proud of it. Seek it out, read it, teach it to your children, have the conversations that make other people uncomfortable because those conversations are not provocations, they are acts of self-preservation. The low self-esteem, the internalized inferiority, the belief that you cannot compete or contribute, these are not your fault and they are not your destiny. They are the predictable results of a system that worked very hard to make you forget who you are. And the research confirms this is exactly what Black History Month provides. The knowledge of who your people have always been. Your pride does not need to be justified to anyone. Your history does not need to be approved. Your identity does not need to be defended. Stand on it. Celebrate it. Refuse to shrink to make others comfortable. This is not arrogance. This is the most reasonable response to everything that has been done to diminish you. The opposition to Black History Month ultimately rests on an implicit belief that Black people have made no meaningful contributions to civilization, and that belief, whether conscious or not, needs to be examined and rejected. Beneath all the arguments, the claims of divisiveness, reverse racism, victimhood, and the demands to move on, there is a question nobody wants to say out loud. Do you actually believe that Black people made no meaningful contributions to human civilization? If the answer is yes, the problem is far greater than a calendar month and needs to be examined with genuine intellectual honesty. If the question is no, if Black contributions to science, art, medicine, philosophy, and the building of nations are acknowledged, then the objection to celebrating those contributions collapses entirely. To those who say race does not matter, if that is true, Black History Month should produce no reaction. If it does matter, if it does produce a strong reaction, then race clearly does matter to you. Own that. Then ask yourself, why do you extend that sense of racial pride to yourself, deny it to others? Black History Month makes no demand of guilt, shame, or the diminishment of any other group. It simply says, we were here, we built things, we thought things, we endured and created and contributed. And those stories deserve to be told. A story that includes everyone else is simply more true than one that does not. Truth, even when it is uncomfortable, is always worth celebrating, and no group should ever have to ask permission to know their story. Knowledge without action is incomplete. You should actively seek out Black history that was not in your textbooks. It exists, it is documented, it is available to everyone willing to look for it. Do not wait for institutions to seek it yourself. Read books, have the conversations. When you encounter a fact about Black history that surprises you, do not dismiss it, investigate it. Let the unfamiliarity become a compass pointing towards something you needed to know. Teach it. Pass the history on to your children, your community, and anyone who will listen. The erasure of Black history was systemic and deliberate. The restoration of it must be equally deliberate. Every conversation, every dinner table discussion, every classroom moment where Black history is shared is an act of resistance against that erasure. Refuse to be silenced. When someone gets offended by Black history, do not interpret their offense as a reason to stop talking. Their discomfort is not your responsibility. Your history is not a provocation. You do not owe anyone the suppression of your own story. Have the conversation anyway, calmly, confidently, and with the knowledge that your facts are on your side. Extend to others what you want for yourself. If you believe your heritage deserves to be celebrated, act accordingly towards others. The same grace you want for your own history, the freedom to discuss it, celebrate it, and be proud of it without being accused of attacking anyone. Extend that same grace to others and to every group that has been written out of history. A world where everyone's history is valued is not a threat to anyone. It is simply a more honest world than the one we currently inhabit. Remember why it matters. This is not about February. It is not about a calendar month or a school curriculum or a political debate. It is about what happens when a child grows up believing they have no history, no heroes, no legacy worth knowing. It is about what becomes possible when that same child discovers the truth. And it is about the kind of society we are choosing to be. One that includes everyone in the human story, or one that does not. We already know which kind of society produces when it does not. The outcomes. The only question is whether we have the honesty and courage to build it.